May 28, 1940. The beaches of Dunkirk are burning. The smoke is visible from the English coast, 30 miles away. Black columns of it, rising from fuel depots and broken ships and things that were, hours ago, still alive. On the beach itself, somewhere between 200 and 400,000 men are waiting to be rescued or killed, and nobody yet knows which it will be. The Royal Navy is improvising. Civilian boats are being requisitioned. Officers are making decisions with incomplete information, which is the only kind of information anyone has. Somewhere in the chaos of the British retreat through France, as artillery shakes the earth and the sky fills with smoke, a British officer raises his hand. In it, not a pistol, not a grenade, a longbow. He draws the string to his cheek, picks a target, and releases. The arrow finds a German NCO in the chest. Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill has just become, in all likelihood, the last British soldier in history to kill an enemy in battle with a longbow, and he's only getting started. Jack Churchill was born in 1906 in Hong Kong, the son of a colonial civil servant. The British Empire was still, at that point, a thing that functioned, a vast and creaking machine of administrators and soldiers and shipping routes that coloured a third of the world map red. Hong Kong was one of its outposts, orderly and strange, a city that belonged to Britain by accident of war and remained British by the logic of inertia. It was not the worst place to be born. It gave a certain kind of young man a certain kind of confidence, the confidence of someone who grew up believing that the world operated according to comprehensible rules. Time equals 4 milliseconds / greater than, and that the right sort of person could navigate those rules to their advantage. Churchill was educated at King William's College on the Isle of Man, then the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, which was the expected path for a young man of his background. He was commissioned into the Manchester Regiment in 1926 and served in Burma, which in 1926 was still a province of British India and about as far from the centres of European power as it was possible to get, while still being technically part of the same administrative structure. He learned what soldiers learn in postings like that: patience, improvisation, the particular skill of maintaining authority in places where authority has no obvious basis. He was, on paper, a perfectly conventional British officer. Paper rarely captures the whole man. Churchill resigned his commission in 1936. The reasons are not entirely clear, and Churchill himself was not a man who offered elaborate explanations for his decisions. He became a model. He appeared in the film The Thief of Baghdad. He competed in archery at the 1939 World Archery Championships, representing Great Britain, not as a hobby archer, but as a serious, competitive athlete who had trained the longbow to a level of practical competence that most people in 1939 would have considered an eccentric historical curiosity. He learned to play the bagpipes, which is not a casual undertaking. The great Highland bagpipe requires months of dedicated practice before it produces anything recognizable as music, and years before it produces anything worth listening to. Churchill put in the years. He rode a motorcycle through Iraq, when Iraq was still a place you could casually motorcycle through, which in the late 1930s was the kind of journey that required either exceptional planning or exceptional confidence in one's own ability to improvise. He was not, in any ordinary sense, preparing for war. But then the war came, and Jack Churchill, Mad Jack, as his colleagues would come to call him, rejoined the army. He brought his bagpipes. He brought his broadsword, a genuine Scottish claymore of the kind that had not seen active military service in roughly 2 centuries. He brought his longbow. He brought them, and he used them. The moment at L'Épinette in May 1940 is almost too absurd to be believed, which is precisely why it is so well documented. Multiple witnesses confirmed what they saw. An officer, in the middle of a tactical withdrawal through occupied France, in one of the most chaotic and desperate military retreats in British history, stopping to loose an arrow from a longbow at a German soldier. Churchill's reasoning was straightforward. He had the bow. He was trained with the bow. The enemy was in range. Why would he not use it? This logic, applied consistently over the next 5 years of war, would take him to Norway, to North Africa, to Sicily, and finally to Yugoslavia, where he would perform acts of such improbable personal courage that the official military records read less like history and more like fiction. He was mentioned in dispatches. He received the Military Cross, then a bar to that cross, then the Distinguished Service Order with a second bar. He was, by any measure, not simply an eccentric. He was genuinely, demonstrably, extraordinarily effective. The commando units Churchill served with and eventually commanded were not the kind of organization that rewarded theatrics at the expense of results. The Special Service Brigade, which became the Commandos, was a new kind of fighting force designed for a new kind of war, small, fast, capable of operating behind enemy lines with minimal support. It required men who could think clearly under pressure, lead without the usual infrastructure of military authority, and make good decisions when all the decisions available were bad. Churchill thrived in this environment. In December 1941, Churchill was commanding No. 3 Commando in a raid on the Norwegian island of Foxhole. The objective was to destroy fish oil factories that the Germans were using for industrial production, disrupt shipping operations, and demonstrate to the Norwegian population that the British were still capable of projecting force. The planning was meticulous. The execution was violent. As the landing craft approached the shore under fire, the other officers prepared their men for the assault. Churchill stood at the front of the boat and played his bagpipes. The tune was March of the Cameron Men, a Scottish march that dates to the early 19th century and has nothing in particular to do with Norwegian fish oil factories, which was beside the point. When the ramp dropped, he leapt ashore, still playing, switched to his sword, and led the attack into the town. This was not spontaneous bravado. Churchill believed, had thought carefully about, the psychological effect of personal example on troops. Men who are about to run toward people who are trying to kill them will find reasons to hesitate. The hesitation is rational. What overcomes it is not rational argument, but direct human example. The sight of another man, specifically the man they are supposed to follow, going first, and going fast, and going without visible fear. The bagpipes were not decoration. They were a weapon in their own way. They said, "I am not afraid. Follow me." His men followed him. The raid on Foxhole was a success. By 1943, Churchill was commanding No. 2 Commando in the invasion of Sicily. In the assault near Molina, he led an attack through a minefield in pitch darkness. He was captured briefly and escaped. The British official history of the commando operations, time equals 4 milliseconds, describes his conduct in terms that sound borrowed from a medieval chronicle. But it was in the Adriatic, off the coast of Yugoslavia, that Churchill's war reached its defining passage. By 1944, the Allied strategy in the Mediterranean had expanded to include support for Yugoslav partisan forces fighting the German occupation. The commandos were deployed in a series of raids along the Dalmatian coast, small, fast operations designed to tie down German forces and demonstrate Allied commitment to the resistance. In January 1944, during a raid near the island of Brac, Churchill walked into a German patrol in the dark. What followed depended entirely on the speed of the man with the sword. Churchill drew it. He attacked. He was captured, not killed, captured, because, as one German officer reportedly remarked, they had never encountered anything like this man and were uncertain what exactly to do with him. He was sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, one of the major camps in the system, located north of Berlin. The Germans, who had catalogued and processed human beings with industrial efficiency for nearly a decade, found Churchill genuinely confusing. An officer, a gentleman, a man who had attacked their patrol with a sword. The categories did not align neatly. As the Allied advance made Sachsenhausen increasingly untenable, Churchill was transferred south, toward the Tyrol, with a group of other high-value prisoners. In April 1945, the group was liberated, though Churchill, with characteristic initiative, had already organized an escape before liberation arrived. He walked over 100 miles through the Austrian mountains to reach Allied lines. The war in Europe had 3 weeks left to run. He was alive. Here is where the easy storytelling breaks down and something more interesting appears. Jack Churchill was not performing. He was not doing this for the historical record or for the cameras. He genuinely believed that the sword was a useful weapon, that personal courage was the decisive factor in battle, and that men who made themselves small and careful were less effective than men who made themselves impossible to ignore. In a war that had become defined by its machinery, by the tank and the bomber and the artillery piece and the industrial logic that supplied them all, Churchill was insisting on something older and less fashionable. He said, in one of his more quoted lines, "Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." He meant it. This was not the sentiment of a man stuck in the past. Churchill was an excellent tactical commander, praised by subordinates and superiors alike for clear thinking under pressure. He understood modern warfare in detail. He simply also believed that the personal example of a man who would walk into a minefield with a sword served a purpose that no amount of tactical planning could replace. The sword was not a substitute for tactics. It was a statement about the man making the tactics, that this man would not ask his soldiers to do anything he would not do first, visibly, with a weapon that offered no range advantage and no mechanical protection, in full view of everyone watching. He was not wrong. His units fought well. His men trusted him. The raids succeeded. Churchill survived the war and lived until 1996, dying at the age of 89. After Germany surrendered, he requested transfer to the Pacific Theatre, reasoning that the war against Japan was still ongoing and that there was therefore no legitimate reason for him to stop fighting. He wanted to continue. The atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war before he arrived, and Churchill's reaction to this was, characteristically, not relief. "If it hadn't been for those damned Yanks," he reportedly said, "we could have kept the war going another 10 years. Whether he was entirely serious is perhaps the wrong question. The right question is whether, for Jack Churchill, the end of the war represented a loss of something he had found nowhere else. He learned to surf in his 50s, on the waves off Weston-super-Mare in the Bristol Channel, which is about as unsurfable a stretch of coastline as England offers. The water is cold, the waves are small and irregular. The beach itself is the kind of grey pebble expanse that discourages leisure. Churchill surfed it anyway. He would carry his surfboard onto commuter trains in London and ride to the Thames, where he would throw the board into the river and body surf the wake of passing launches, in full view of morning commuters in suits reading their newspapers. The commuters, being English, pretended not to notice. He was, in other words, completely consistent. The man who played bagpipes on a landing craft under fire was the same man who surfed the Thames in a business suit. The man who led a charge with a broadsword in 1944 was the same man who carried a surfboard through the London Underground in 1958. The logic was identical throughout. There was something he wanted to do, and no convention stood between him and doing it. It would be easy to frame Jack Churchill as a punchline, the eccentric British officer who went to war with a medieval weapon. The man who was too strange for even the Second World War to fully absorb. Military history is full of characters who serve primarily as comic relief, men whose eccentricities are amusing precisely because they had no real consequences. Churchill is not that. The eccentricities had consequences, very specific consequences, measured in raids that succeeded and men who followed and objectives that were taken. Churchill's sword was not a joke. It was a deliberate statement about the nature of courage and the nature of war. That the weapons of a warrior, time equals 400 milliseconds, are not only the ones that fire bullets. That presence, undeniable, visible, physical presence, changes what is possible in battle. That a man who advances when all logic says to advance only cautiously creates a different reality than the one that existed before he advanced. He carried the sword because he believed in what it meant, and in the long, ugly, mechanized horror of the Second World War, a war fought mostly from distances, mostly with machinery, mostly in conditions designed to make individual human beings feel entirely irrelevant. Time equals 4 milliseconds to outcomes determined by production capacity and logistics. Jack Churchill insisted on relevance, on the relevance of the individual, on the idea that one man, in one moment, choosing to go forward when retreat was rational, could change what happened next, loudly, with bagpipes. It is May 28, 1940. The beaches of Dunkirk are burning. A British officer draws a bowstring to his cheek. The arrow flies. Somewhere in a British unit, watching an officer hold his ground in a retreating army with a weapon that belongs in a museum, there are men who decide, because of what they have seen, because of the specific and unrepeatable example of one man refusing to make himself small, to hold theirs. Jack Churchill understood that war is, in the end, waged by men, not by machines, not by strategy, not by production capacity or logistics chains, or the industrial output of nations, by individual human beings who choose, in a specific moment, what they will do. All the machinery of war eventually reduces to that moment, the moment when one man decides. He had made his choice long before the war began. He had made it every morning he picked up the sword, every raid, every landing, every minefield crossed in darkness. He had brought his sword, and in the logic of Jack Churchill, a logic that was, beneath its surface strangeness, entirely coherent, that was enough.